traveling abroad with type 1 diabetes. The thought of traveling internationally with type 1 can certainly be overwhelming. There's all of the unfamiliar foods, there's language barriers, adjusting to new time zones, going through borders and customs with prescription medications. The list of considerations can seemingly be endless. Our guests on this week's episode of The Leap will be making the case that traveling abroad with T1D is not only realistic and achievable, but it's also well worth the extra time that's required in planning. Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of The Leap, a video and podcast series brought to you by the Diabetes Family Connection, where we find inspirational folks who have stepped outside of their comfort zones, taken a leap of faith, all while navigating the highs and lows of type 1 diabetes. And by hearing these stories and experiences, hopefully you'll be inspired to take your own leap of faith and realize that the sky is truly the limit with type 1 diabetes. In this week's episode, we sat down with Dr. Ameer Hamdan, Katie Kraft, and Frannie Burson, three globetrotters who have brought their type 1 diabetes on adventures across Southeast Asia, the Middle East, South America, Africa, and beyond. Our guests today break down a lot of the fears one might have before traveling internationally and answer all sorts of great questions. If you're ready to step outside your little corner of the earth, this episode is for you. Now, I am probably biased, but I could not be more excited for tonight's episode of The Leap, where we are tackling traveling abroad with type 1 diabetes. There is a famous quote that comes to mind. Y'all are probably aware of it. It says, traveling is the only thing you can spend your money on and actually end up richer. And I think it's probably apparent that that original author wasn't aware of how general investing works or the stock market or how much money he'd be worth had he not sold his Beanie Baby collection. Bad joke. Regardless, there is a lot of truth in that statement. There's a lot of personal growth and enrichment that comes with traveling. And it's unfortunate that I think sometimes when you are living with type 1, the thought of traveling internationally can be overwhelming and intimidating, and you might shy away from even trying that experience. So I'm very grateful that we have an all-star cast with us tonight who are not only living with type 1, but have actually reached almost every corner of the globe, it seems like, and are here to share their experiences and their stories to show that you absolutely can travel safely abroad. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and jump into introductions. So if you want to say who you are, where you are located in the world right now, what your life looks like when you are not traveling, and how long you've been living with type 1 diabetes. And Katie, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Thanks for having me, Patrick. I'm excited to be here tonight. My name's Katie, and I live in Oakland, California. Home for me will always be Georgia, though. And when I'm not traveling, I am probably either at diabetes camp or at my job at Children's Hospital Oakland. I'm a certified child life specialist there.
All right, Ameer, we're going to pass it over to you.
All right. Thanks for having me, Patrick. And hey, everybody. My name is Ameer. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina. When I'm not traveling, I work in Durham, North Carolina as a hospitalist.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Frannie, we are going to pass it over to you.
Great. Yeah, thanks for having me, Patrick. I'm Frannie. I currently, when not traveling, live in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I work for a lighting agency here.
One more quick question, because I think it helps people to kind of make parallels with their own diabetes management. If everyone just wants to say how they currently manage their diabetes. Frannie, we'll start with you.
Yeah. So forgot to say how long I've had diabetes.
Oh.
I just celebrated my 18th anniversary, so my diabetes can officially vote. I like to go back and forth. I'm currently on shots and wear a Dexcom.
How about you, Ameer?
I also forgot to say how long I have diabetes. 22 years. So 22 years with diabetes, and I've used a lot of different things, but right now I've got the Dexcom G6, and I'm also using T-Slim.
Are you using the Control IQ system, Ameer?
Right now, I actually have not seen my doctor upgrade to that yet.
Okay. Are you on basal IQ then?
Yes.
Cool.
And that's a lifesaver.
Awesome. All right, Katie, what systems are you using?
Currently, I am looping, which I absolutely love. So I use the old Medtronic pump, my handy dandy Riley Link, which converts the radio waves to Bluetooth waves so it can talk to my app on my phone that I made with the help of Tamar. And I love it. It has definitely changed my life with diabetes. I I've had diabetes for 21 years. So congratulations, Frannie, on your diabetes being able to vote. Mine can now party in Las Vegas. And the plan was to be in Las Vegas for my 21st birthday. It's actually in October, but obviously those plans are going to have to wait a little while. You're all invited though.
Fantastic. This is cool. So we kind of have a spread of different management techniques while you're traveling abroad. So this will be great. So let's quickly kind of jump into our traveling portfolio. So if you all can kind of talk about different experiences that you have had abroad, so places you've visited, and then maybe if you could talk a little bit about the longest trip that you've had or the longest duration you've been abroad. Katie, we'll start with you on this one.
I need to sit down and count countries, but it's somewhere around 29 or 30. And yeah, from trips with friends in the beginning to, places in Europe. And then most recently, I think my last trip was a solo trip to the Philippines. Longest length of time is no more than, I guess studying abroad, if that counts, but a couple weeks at a time when I can take chunks off of work. I think Ethiopia is pretty memorable. There's so many amazing things there, from the bleeding heart baboons to lava lakes, and yeah, there's all kinds of crazy adventures from Ethiopia.
Ameer, we're going to pass it over to you.
So I think somewhere around 12 countries. And some of them I visited more than once, so actually 25 international trips total. And I think, traveling abroad is a big part of it, but also traveling domestically is a big thing too. So I even counted my states at 24, so I want to see the rest of them at some point. Probably some highlights. I got to go to Cuba pre-COVID. I got to go to Croatia, which was gorgeous, and had a blast in South Africa. So I've been just trying to see what I can see, experience new foods, cultures. So it's been great.
Very cool. What's the longest you've been gone?
So I took a trip in a summer in high school, and I was in England for a month. Besides that, probably just really keeping around 2 weeks now when I get to travel.
Great. All right, Frannie.
Yeah, so I started traveling really young because my parents kind of gave me the bug. So we would hop around Europe with my family. And then I got to go to Australia. My brother was studying abroad there. So I did about a 3-week trip in high school to Australia. Then I studied abroad in South Africa for a summer during college. And just 2 years ago, it's been my longest trip. I did a backpacking trip through Southeast Asia, and I was gone for almost 4 months over there.
Wow. Definitely some impressive portfolios when it comes to traveling. You all are going to be experts on this. This is great. So we'll kind of talk about the pre-trip planning process. Does living with type 1, has that ever impacted a decision on where you decide to travel to?
It has not impacted or kind of affected where I decide to travel. I've been able to, I feel like if you're going on a trip within the US, you can make the same plans if you're making a trip outside of the US. We just have to do a few extra things, and planning wise, you can get, loaner pumps or take extra insulin if you're on injections. So I haven't let that negatively impact me. And it sounds like the rest of the folks, Frannie, with your 4-month trip, make sure you have all the right supplies and everything. So it's been, I don't think it's been a barrier, just something that I have to consider when I'm making those trips.
Awesome. So it sounds like everyone kind of has a similar confidence and sentiment with diabetes not being a barrier to their traveling. Has that been a confidence that you've always had, or has that confidence grown with the more travel that you've gotten under your belt? Katie, I'll pass that one over to you.
I think that's a great question. I feel like I'm really thankful for my experiences with traveling, and that were in more developed countries at the beginning of growing my confidence as a traveler. I definitely always had pharmacies, close by, and hospitals close by. And I think that for my first, trips abroad solo, or not solo, but with friends without parents there, as an older teen and in your 20s, that's a nice thing to have as you're learning how to navigate challenges of travel and so many different factors between food and sickness and altitudes and time changes. It's just a nice kind of comfort blanket to know that those things are nearby. I definitely think I've grown in that confidence over the years, and all it takes is, more planning and more research, and knowing that what you need, and how to advocate for yourself and how to prepare. And in ways that are going to, make you successful in unique situations, no matter where those are. So I definitely feel more confident now traveling a broader range of places where I can be, outside of driving distance from a hospital for days or nowhere near a pharmacy. And I feel confident in my ability to keep insulin cool and all my supplies close by. And I don't know that I was there when I was 18 and, took those first trips alone. So I'm glad that I've had some countries under my belt to be able to learn new tips.
Right. You have definitely brought up some awesome topics, and we're going to take a much deeper dive in some of those specific things that you brought up. At this point, you've decided where you're going to go travel next. Frannie, what happens next? Do you have a conversation with your healthcare provider? If so, what does that conversation look like?
Absolutely. The best thing to say is when you're planning ahead, especially if you're going to do it for like a really long trip, you definitely need to talk to your endocrinologist because you have to think that you would normally, if I'm gone for 4 months, you can get your prescription every 3 months. So how do you make your supplies last that long? So you talk to your doctor and they can usually write you a letter to your insurance companies that will let you have an extended amount of supplies for a long period of time. So instead of picking it up once every 3 months, once every month, I got 6 months of all of my diabetes supplies at once. And I figured I would probably be there for about 4. I wanted to have plenty, so I got 6. The other interesting part of that, though, is when you're traveling, a lot of times you're only allowed to travel with like a certain amount of prescriptions on your person at once. Like TSA will check that. So to kind of like get around that loophole, if there was one, every time I've traveled for an extensive period of time, I just have my endocrinologist write a letter that I keep with my prescriptions in my bag. I always keep my diabetes supplies in my carry-on, by the way, never ever check them. And I have been stopped by TSA, but when they go through them and go through all of the stuff, I have my letter right there from my doctor saying this is the amount of medication they need for their type 1 diabetes for the duration of their travel. They are approved to fly and travel with them, something along those lines.
Awesome. That actually segues into kind of our next topic, our next big topic, which is going through that packing checklist. And I'm not totally concerned about how many pairs of underwear you're bringing, Ameer, but I do want to know specifically, what are you thinking about diabetes-wise that might be different than when you're traveling domestically, let's say? So kind of tell me what's going through your head in that thought process when you're packing for an international trip.
The thought process. So where am I going? How long am I going to be there? But anytime I travel, I think about, okay, I've got my pump. The perfect example is when I had my Medtronic. What I did there is it had actually been out of warranty. And so I was like, okay, the pump's a little old. I was actually trying to figure out, do I stay with Medtronic? Do I go with Tandem? Because I used the Dexcom trying to figure out the system. But Medtronic and Tandem and most of your, I think, pump companies, they all have a loaner program. And so for an extended trip, I actually thought it would be a good idea to get a loaner. It was $50 with Medtronic. So I traveled with that and I got it for 90 days. And then you just return it when you're done. But supply wise, I'm a big, just take double what I need. Take 2 vials of insulin in case something happens to one, take 2 sets of reservoirs, 2 sets of sites. And pretty much I'm really set when I do that. And obviously now, since we don't use batteries, something to charge it with. And actually, I didn't know if you like props. I'm a big fan of one of these, a converter that has the USB in it port. So you can charge multiple things, phone, insulin pump, everything at one time. But yeah, I think the answer is 2 of everything. And I also take from a different box, just in case there is a, like, I don't know, so every once in a while you get a bad lot of a supply, just so I don't run any side effects there.
One of the things that just came to mind when you showed that converter, have you ever had concerns about voltage or different power wattage that comes out of different countries' outlets when charging medical devices?
So the answer simply is yes. And so I charge in a battery pack with the pump.
Oh, that's great. That's awesome. Katie, when you're packing, what are you kind of thinking in terms of backups if one of your systems were to fail? Obviously, if something were to go wrong abroad, it's going to be a little bit more of a headache, or it could potentially be a lot more of a headache getting backup supplies than if you were to be traveling domestically.
Totally. I usually bring an old pump with me. I've never done a loaner pump, but that's just because I have, older pumps that I've been on before available. And then I always have syringes. Syringes and insulin are just, our basics. And if everything else fails, you can get through the day with those guys. So that's always my go-to systems wise. And then just like Ameer, I always pack double whenever I'm going. And I tend to try and extend wear on things too, to just make sure that I have plenty of supplies at the end. When I'm traveling, I do a lot more, adventurous stuff that it might get ripped off in rivers or waterfalls, or there might be more sweat if you're hiking. And so trying to wear things as long as I can. If I would normally leave a set in for 3 days, I might do more like 5 just to make sure that I have plenty of sets, and figuring I'll probably rip a few out along the way too. Same with sensors.
Great.
I had the struggle. I guess my biggest thing with packing for me was I knew insulin was going to be different in Asia, and not just like different names, but their whole units are different. So you'd have to learn a whole different conversion chart and such. So I talked to my doctor, and I figured with backpacking, with the limited amount of space I actually had in my pack, the best option for me was just to take pens. And so I ended up taking about 6 months worth of insulin pens with me to Asia. And the biggest thing was, how do I keep them cold? Because like we all know, insulin, can only stay out of the fridge for about 28 days. So I had to get pretty creative through that. If you guys have ever heard of Frio packs, they're amazing. They have these little crystals in them. You just soak them in water for about 30 minutes and they puff up, and then you stick some insulin in there and it can keep them cold for about 12. I definitely kept them in there for longer than 12 hours without recharging. But so that was the first thing, just like, how do I fly all the way over there and keep all this insulin cold? Because, if it all goes bad, then I'm just not going to be in a good place. So I do use the Frios to get to Asia, which, took about 35 hours or so with the flights total to get there. And then once I got there, I ended up just like going every time I would check into a new hostel. Everyone was so friendly. I got really good at using Google Translate, just kind of explain to them the situation. If I have medication, it needs to stay cold. Can I store this in your fridge in your kitchen? And then I would always, go with them to the kitchen to see physically where it was stored. You never know with the different languages. I was worried sometimes they might misunderstand me and put it in the freezer, and then that would not be good. So it was always, I never felt unsafe with that. Even sometimes there was a communal fridge and I just had labeled it really big on there, like medication, kept it in the fridge. In the Frio packs, in the sleeves, so they wouldn't just like be out and about. So like you would take the crystal part out and they just have these sleeves that wrap around them. And then the only other really interesting experience I had with keeping insulin cold was, it was very shortly after I got there. So I was still kind of learning the ropes, and I knew I was going to be on a bus for about 14 hours, and Thailand is notorious for not having air conditioning on buses. So I was really panicked that, at the very beginning of my trip, all of my insulin was going to go bad. So I ended up going to like a little supermarket and found like a teeny tiny styrofoam cooler about this big. And then I got little mini bottles of water and stuck them in the hostel freezer the night before. So they were frozen. And I just like stuck them down in this styrofoam cooler, put all of my insulin in there, and just held it on my lap for 14 hours as we drove. And thank God we did, because there was no AC on that bus and it was miserable, and I probably would have been in a very bad situation otherwise. But obviously, before you go, I did a lot of research about, if I'm taking this type of insulin, what is the name of it in this language? And then I would print it off. So I had, not just on my phone, you never know if you don't have Wi-Fi and can Google. So I had physical paper copies of what all of the drugs and all of the countries I thought I might be going to, like what they were called, and so forth. And did not have to actually, thankfully, do that experience. So my insulin was good for 4 months.
Woohoo.
Frannie's quite the MacGyver of traveling internationally and with diabetes. Awesome. Ameer, so Frannie touched on this a little bit, but a lot of times when you're traveling abroad, that can involve traveling to countries where you might not speak the native language or English is not widely spoken. What are some things, some considerations you take into place then? Are there particular phrases that you try to learn ahead of time regarding diabetes?
It's a great question. Fortunately, most of the countries I go to, people have spoken English. But I'm 100% agree. Google Translate has been super helpful. And then also now it has the video option or the camera option, so you can actually put it up to what you're reading, and it'll translate it on your phone to English for you. But there are several ways to communicate. But I think learning like diabetes in the native tongue, because it's everywhere, and so everybody knows about it. And so if you actually do need help, and you can kind of tell somebody what's going on, just with the term. And then, I think learning high and low and insulin are all helpful too.
Great. Katie, show what you're holding up there.
Vanna White this. AccuCheck has some awesome just little phrases about diabetes, like I am diabetic, where's the nearest pharmacy? This is an insulin pump, all these things in some different languages already on their website that are translated in native tongue. Google Translate's amazing. I also know that it's not always right, and so I like, if I have the ability to have somebody that speaks the language look over those phrases beforehand. And then also, since I can't always depend on Wi-Fi when I'm traveling, I just like to have things in paper still. So some of those phrases that might be helpful, I need sugar, but you were asking about different languages, and it just reminded me of a funny story of when I was in Honduras, and they were pointing to my insulin pump at TSA, and I was saying it was a bomba de insulina, and bomba means both pump and bomb in Spanish. And so then everybody's eyes, got really big, and they're like, ah! I'm like, no, medicina de diabetes. And yeah, so all kinds of fun translation stories from being abroad. But I do think having those phrases down so you can point to the ones in addition to having your phone for Google Translate is really helpful.
Sorry, Patrick, for the Google stuff, and also just in general. So you can actually download to have offline access to Google Translate and certain maps. So I think those are two really helpful things to have, because that way, if you're somewhere and you don't know the terrain in the area, you have a map that's available, but you don't require Wi-Fi or internet service.
Maps.me saved my life.
Maps. We've got all sorts of great resources going on here. Ameer, I'm going to pitch this one to you because you're going to have a unique perspective, being not only a provider in the US, but also kind of your perspective of the healthcare in other, could be developing countries or just other countries in general. What are some considerations or thoughts you kind of take into place when you're traveling to a country where the quality of the healthcare might be questionable?
So part of this is like not going to be very helpful to you guys, because I've had good travel experiences. I haven't had those types of setbacks. And so I tend to take a lot of it into my own hands and be prepared, in the sense, like, what Franny's talked about, what Katie's talked about, kind of having the supplies, having the backup. I've actually, when I think about it, haven't done any solo trips. I'm always going with somebody or meeting somebody there. And so making sure that the folks I'm with kind of understand diabetes and what to do if there's an emergency. I definitely am interested in like different aspects of healthcare and want to see what different countries offer. But for me personally, it hasn't like impacted my travel. I think, and I don't know what other people's experiences are with health insurance, but it's something else to consider. In some insurances give you international coverage, most don't. And then kind of thinking about, do I get travel insurance to have me covered if there's something, some emergency or something happens, or some credit cards actually offer it. So just to kind of know what your credit card offers, or do I need to get the travel insurance?
So it's really kind of just thinking through the potential, most likely problems that could come up before they ever even do come up.
Yeah.
Does anyone have a different experience or anything to add to what Ameer had to say?
I've had pretty good, like Ameer, experiences. I definitely have gotten travel insurance every time I've been abroad for an extensive period of time. And I remember doing some research and making sure with different options with travel insurance that I did have a medical evacuation plan in my travel insurance, just in case something did happen. I had a bad blow, or I was in somewhere remote and needed to get to a hospital. Like, I had insurance that would make sure I got there.
Great. Katie, we'll pitch this one to you. So the next stage, you've got your trip planned out, and now you are getting prepared to get on that flight. And flying can be a source of anxiety for all sorts of reasons. But when you're thinking about flying with diabetes, there certainly could be some other factors that come into play there. Frannie talked about this a little bit, but when you are packing your bags for a flight, what are you doing specifically with your diabetes supplies? Do you put them all in your carry-on bag? Kind of talk through your process with that.
Yeah, I try and fit everything I can on my carry-on. Absolutely, your insulin, your test strips, your sensors, anything that's going to be sensitive to temperatures has to go on your carry-on. But things like reservoirs or syringes that might take up a lot of space that I don't have as much room for, depending on how long I'm going. You could divide some of those up. Mostly, I always want to keep them with me unless it's just not an option. And then also while traveling, we've had, bags stolen from friends that I've been traveling with before. And I think it just really terrified me the first time it happened because it just happened so quickly. And that could have been all of my supplies, that disappeared, and our bags are sitting right next to each other. And so, yeah, just thinking about in an instant, if your supplies are all in the same place and that bag disappears, what does that mean for you? And so I always felt really embarrassed to ask people I was traveling with to carry anything for me. I feel very independent in my diabetes care. I don't want to share that or burden other people with having to take care of it or carry supplies. But after that experience, I don't have any hesitation to ask people I'm traveling with, hey, will you carry an extra meter for me and this bottle of insulin? And I'm happy to carry your socks or, like whatever else we can trade. Because, yeah, I do feel like there's a little bit of fear that goes along with putting all your eggs in one basket sort of thing. So I do like to spread them out, but definitely I'm always keeping any temperature safe or temperature sensitive stuff with me in my carry-on luggage. So when you're packing so many supplies, sometimes you just run out of room too, right? If you're packing double or triple.
I think that brings up a good point, because I know a lot of airlines have specific parameters in terms of how many carry-on bags you might be able to have. Do we have any rights as people living with type 1, or do we get any kind of accommodations because we have type 1? Does anyone know the answer to that?
Yeah, the ADA has some language, I think, about bringing extra bags specifically for medical needs, but it really depends on the airline. So calling ahead and checking. My friend Tia was just traveling to Israel and had an extra bag, and they told her, no, that's not a thing. And she was like, wait, no, it is a thing. Like, I can carry this extra bag of medical supplies. So just making sure you check first with the airline, I think, is the best idea. And then also realizing when you're coming back, the same rules may not apply as going there.
Great. Frannie, I'll pitch this one to you. Traveling abroad obviously involves pretty long flights most of the time. And when you mix long flights with the expensive airline foods that you find in the airport, or the foods that they provide that you have to pay for when you're actually on the plane, can certainly add up. What are you bringing for low supplies when you are flying, or food in general?
Yeah. So I typically try not to push my luck when I'm going through TSA, especially if I have a lot of medical supplies. I know I'm probably going to get flagged. I don't like to bring in liquids and extra juice. So I'll typically just have a big tub of glucose gummies or glucose tabs in there that I know it's fine. And then as soon as I get through security at the airport, I'll just go straight to the snack bar and get some sort of big juice to have on me, some snacks. If you're on a long flight, they typically do serve you a meal, at least one. I mean, I'm not sure with COVID times how that still works, but so I typically know I'll get a good meal at some point, but you just never know, especially on a long flight, what's going to happen. So that's usually I like the combos. They're my secret shame airport snack, because they're really high in calories.
Great. Frannie started touching on it, Ameer. The TSA experience, or going through security. You're not flying without going through TSA. And I know for myself personally, with all my diabetes supplies, it can be an anxious time of kind of explaining it. Are you telling the TSA agent that you're living with type 1? At what point do you tell the agent? What is your rule of thumb with that?
That's a good question. I tell them pretty early, actually, because I've got the pump, and I used to, when I was a kid, disconnect the pump and let it go through the X-ray, which I don't think we're supposed to do. And I got to a point where I kind of just got tired of it. And I think, fortunately, in the U.S., most people recognize an insulin pump. If you tell them early, they get you through the right scanner and they'll pat your hands down and make sure everything's fine. Internationally, I've like run into a couple snags, but eventually, as long as you just take a minute and explain yourself, you can hopefully eventually get through. A lot of times they still don't understand the disconnect of like why I don't want to. I haven't run into issues with my Dexcom though, and I'm always wondering what's going to happen when somebody like pats that and says, "What's that? Why can't you take that off?" So it's a matter of just going through it. Luckily, I don't know. I have TSA pre-check. It only means a shorter line. I get to keep my shoes on, but diabetes-wise, it's exactly the same.
Great. So Katie, the kind of the three options when you're going through TSA, you could go through the metal detector, you could go through the full body scanner, or you could do kind of a hybrid, which usually involves a pat down and a wand with some sort of medical detector device. Do you pick one over the other? What are your rights as someone living with type 1? Can you request to go through one over the other?
Yeah, absolutely. I always choose the pat down because I've heard of 2 instances where people's pumps have malfunctioned after they've gone through the X-ray machines, and that is not how I want to start out a trip. So I just always opt for the pat down. Sometimes you have to wait longer. It's a little obnoxious, but to me, it's worth it for the safety of my devices. Yeah, that's always what I choose, and you can always ask for that.
Have you ever had
Just going off that, by the way, too, because I didn't know this, because I do the same thing now, like better safe than sorry, a lot of times on long trips when I have been wearing my insulin pump. If you ever just like walk as soon as you give them your ID at the TSA, the first person you see, just tell those people you want to opt out. And that is the code that you're not going to go through the scanner. They'll yell it to other people and find you someone that'll pat you down.
Has there ever been concerns about putting any kind of your devices through the X-ray scanner?
I also don't let them put my pump through the X-ray scanner. I just have them do the hand wand to check for the explosive traces on it, and then it gives the okay afterwards. But yeah, I don't let them put it through any sort of X-ray machine.
Hey, you asked the question about packing though, Patrick. I wanted to kind of go back to that.
Yeah.
So I actually only take one bag. I take my one carry-on. It's got a 35-liter pack and a 60-liter pack, which I can make tight and get a little smaller. But that way I kind of always have, I've always got my stuff. That way I don't deal with lost luggage. And then I have another bag inside of that has all my diabetes supplies. I'm a big RX bar fan, and that's not technically liquid. So the RX peanut butters you can bring in, along with some glucose tablets. And I think if you tell anybody you've got low blood sugar, stewardess-wise, they're gonna get you juice without having any like issues or concerns. But I think it's definitely a good idea to ask for the meal times, just so you know what to expect and when you're gonna eat.
Great. Do we have any specific rights as people living with type 1 when it comes specifically to TSA and liquids?
I have gone through security before with a juice, and they told me, oh, you have to throw that out. And it was my only low supply, and I told them I was diabetic, and they let me through fine. So I think, it has to be a small one. I think you're limited to a certain amount of ounces or something. I'm not sure, but you can. I have before taken a juice through security.
Ameer, you touched on this a little bit. So there's different options for kind of expediting your experience through the TSA now. And the two that I'm aware of are TSA PreCheck, and global entry is one that kind of applies to international travel. Can you elaborate on those a little bit and your experience with TSA PreCheck? Is it something that you recommend?
I enjoy having TSA PreCheck just because of the time in the line. It's typically a little bit shorter of a line. You don't have to, if I recall, like pull out your laptop or iPad, and you kind of get to leave your shoes on. It's just a little bit of an expediting experience. As a diabetic, I wouldn't consider it particularly helpful. And the global entry is something I'm going to look into when my TSA PreCheck expires. So I don't know all the specifics of it, but I would say, like, for traveling, if time is an issue for you, or you don't like standing in line, they're very helpful. But for diabetes, I wouldn't say it's particularly useful.
Katie, I'm going to field this one to you. Traveling abroad always involves going through at least one country's customs, sometimes more, and then it will always involve going through your own country's customs when you are returning home. What are some specific things that you're thinking about when going through customs with insulin, with all these prescriptions that you might be carrying to help manage your diabetes?
Yeah. A couple different things. I think when you're in other countries too, just realizing that you're playing by different rules, and that maybe protections or rights or something that you feel like you're used to might not apply to other places. And so, yeah, I think just always being very calm and very respectful and communicative, letting people know why you have things without becoming inflammatory. I think Americans have a reputation as being entitled travelers a lot of the time, and I'd love to break that stereotype and be able to communicate with people better about why and how, and to get through with as few waves as possible. I think something that came up that comes to mind is trying to get home from Israel. When I went to Israel, I brought about 100 syringes with me for the whole trip, just as backup, and trying to come home with 100 syringes was not going to happen. They said, you absolutely can't have these on the plane, they're a weapon. And I was like, has no one with diabetes ever traveled through this TSA agent before? It just strikes me as really interesting that would be a flag. But they said, you can't have these. And I was like, oh, I need them. I have type 1 diabetes, and here's a letter from my doctor, and here's my prescription. They were like, we don't want that, you can't have these. And I was like, so I need them, and this is why. And having a conversation and asking, oh, do you know anybody with diabetes? And like, this is how we get our medication, and we can't live without it. And so just being very patient and calm and polite. But we ended up being there for a very long time, talking with the agents about syringes and whether or not they were allowed. And our flight was getting closer and closer. We didn't have a whole lot of time to have those conversations. And so I ended up asking for a compromise and was like, can I just bring a few with me? I can leave, the 100 that are here with you, but I need to bring a couple with me. And they decided on 3, that I was allowed to bring 3 syringes with me. And so I was flying, back to the States, but was worried, what if something happened and I could need more than 3? But I was like, we need to go. Like, we could miss our flight, and this could become a much bigger deal if we stand here and argue. So, we said, thanks so much. We'll take the 3, and we went on our way. And then, surely enough, there were tornadoes, and we ended up in Alabama for like days longer than we expected to, and it took us a much longer, convoluted route to get home. And all I had were those 3 syringes with me at that time. But we made it work, and you're not always playing by your own rules. And I think it would be, much different in the States if I was traveling through TSA, but I think you have a choice. And do I want to be restrained by Israeli TSA agents if I, get into an altercation with them, or do I just want to try and reach a compromise and like get to the next step and work with what I have?
Great advice. Kill them with kindness if you can, but even if you do, you might not always end up with the best outcome.
And then you'll reuse needles for a while, and it'll be fine.
Right, absolutely. Frannie, Ameer and Katie kind of touched on this a little bit. So thinking about customs and or even TSA and some of the hiccups you might kind of face along the way, how much time before your departure do you kind of give yourself?
Oh gosh. So I always made fun of my mom when we were growing up, because anytime we were flying, she wanted to be at the airport like 4 hours, typical mom ahead of times. So traveling, just domestically, I like to get there, an hour and a half or so before my flight, right on time to get on the plane. If you're traveling internationally, especially if you're traveling with a lot of diabetes supplies, I think the rule of thumb with international travel is you want to get there 2 hours before your flight anyways. I typically add on, maybe get there 3 hours before, just to make sure everything is going smoothly, get through it fine. You don't want to miss that flight. And I have actually, the funny story is when I went to Asia, with what I thought was plenty of time, they completely messed up our tickets. So we got there and we had a reservation, but no tickets booked. So that took about an hour and a half before we could even get through security to get that rearranged. And fortunately it all worked out, but I barely made my flight going over there with TSA, then searching my bags, which they did extensively. And the one thing I will say when TSA, because sometimes, I kind of expected them to when I had 6 months worth of pen needles and the Frio packs, which I think is probably what actually flagged them with these weird crystals. It's just to be calm, like Katie was saying, like don't resort to panic. You want to be assertive enough with them to let them know, like, hey, these are my medical supplies, like, please be gentle. Like, let them know beforehand, before they even open your bag, what they're going to find in there. In the past, my mom has even said, like, can I take these out and show you? I felt comfortable with TSA taking the bag that had my insulin out, since it was pen needles and they're pretty durable, saying you're fine to look at these. But if you're flying with vials and they think they're really fragile and you don't want other people handling them, my mom has, and I've seen it, can I please take these out for you and show you what they are? And they'll probably then do, the flag thing with the bomb test that Katie was talking about. But every time, they're not looking for people in security going through with diabetes supplies. Like, that's not what they're searching for. They're just being safe. And as long as you just stay calm and it's all going to be okay.
Great. It's probably important to note too that your mom is also living with type 1. Is it?
Yes,
Can I say that?
That's an important note. Sorry, my mom is also type 1, and we have done a lot of traveling together. We've experienced some of these crazy moments together. Yeah.
All right, Ameer. So we've started flying. We're maybe arriving in country. We've probably been on the plane for a long time. We have crossed several time zones, maybe experiencing jet lag, maybe have missed some meals. What are you thinking about with diabetes at this point? And the second part to that question, when do you start making adjustments to your basal rates to match up with the time change?
Absolutely. So, sleeping on the plane, eating on the plane, and then the time adjustment. I consider myself a pro at getting over jet lag. I don't watch a movie for a month before I go on a big trip, and then I have a ton to watch there. And then, I actually set alarms so that I can set specific nap times and be ready to go. I find that my basal rates are very dependent on my activity. And so since I'm more active in the afternoon, I tend to that's when I need the basal rate to be a little bit lower so that I don't drop. And so when I'm taking that into account, I kind of adjust and just kind of keep my basal rate where it is, even sometimes may need to go up a little bit because I'm not really active on a plane. I try to get up and stretch every hour, do that sort of thing. But then I think everybody hopefully is kind of getting to where they understand their body and how things are working. And what I mean by that is you can say, okay, when I'm sleeping, this is kind of typically what my basal rate needs to be. And so I'm adjusting accordingly. I actually keep my pump on the same time and adjust the basal rates accordingly. Kind of put temporary, and I just keep a close eye on it. I don't set something for the entire trip because things are going to change, activity is going to change. I'm going to need to continually adjust.
And I would imagine too, being on the basal IQ system, there's some adjustment there that probably helps with that whole process.
Absolutely.
Does anyone have a different experience or rule of thumb?
Yeah, I can add to that one. I feel like since my insulin needs are based on my internal clock rather than, the time on the clock, the first time I go to sleep is the time that I reset. So I'll go to sleep, and then when I wake up, that's when I reset my pump time to the current time zone. So, and then I'll usually do a lower basal overnight. But your body's just so out of whack, and you might take naps here and there, and it's so hard to adjust. But yeah, that first sleep, I feel like, is when I allow my pump to reset and my body to reset together. At least that's the theory.
I have just one more, since I've done it with shots, and that always makes it a little interesting with when do I take my long acting? So I kind of do the same thing as Katie, is I'll keep it the same. I want to take it at the same time until I get there, until I finally fall asleep and kind of figure out my rhythm. And then I'll slowly, for, the next day, if I'm way too early, I'll take it 3 hours later, or 2 hours later, 2 hours later, till if I'm going to be there for a long time, I'll slowly get to where I was taking it at night the same time I was at home. And now it's just technically 12 hours difference than it was before.
Fantastic advice here. Ameer, you touched on it a little bit. You are excited to try new foods when you travel to new countries. Obviously, food and diabetes go hand in hand. Let's say you are looking at a menu. You have no idea what you're eating or what you could be ordering. What's your rule of thumb there? Are you eyeballing things? What are you thinking?
That's a great question. When I'm out at a restaurant, I'm eyeballing. And you want to underestimate rather than overestimate, but you want to keep a close eye on things. And I think traveling with the CGM makes things much more helpful. But especially when you're traveling, there's at least carbohydrates on the packaging, but traveling is not easy. when you're eating out, trying these new foods, and you don't know what's in it. But I don't know if anybody else has other experiences they can kind of talk to, but you just want to do that. A lot of food is similar. I mean, pasta's pasta, ice cream's ice cream, you know, the meats are the meats, but it's a matter of making some subtle adjustments.
Does anyone look up dishes ahead of time or traditional dishes in country and maybe try to explore what the carb count could be? Katie, I see you nodding your head. What's your experience?
I think I grew up with pretty like conservative food choices. We weren't really very adventurous eaters. And so a lot of times the cuisine that I'm trying in a new country might be even the first time that I tried that food when I first started traveling. And since moving to California, we have a lot more options for different kinds of food from lots of different kinds of cultures. But the first time I had ever eaten Indian food was when I was in India. So there's definitely like a learning curve there, and definitely didn't know what I was eating a lot of the time or what saag paneer even meant. And so I definitely needed to look up those foods to even know what it was, and like, oh, is this a starch or is this a potato, or is this a vegetable in here, does it have carbs? And sometimes it's hard to tell when there's so many different spices and flavors and things you've never had. And I'll say in the Philippines too, my first stint there was with Operation Smile, and because I was there with a group, like so many of the meals were catered, so you weren't ordering off a menu. So literally I had no idea what I was eating. It was just a bunch of different colors, on a plate, and you're like, all right, here we go. And so that's a little bit harder when you literally don't know what you're putting in your mouth. But definitely look up foods beforehand and look up some carb counts just to eyeball it. But just like every day with diabetes, it's a lot of trial and error, and we make it through.
Actually, one food I tried that I had a lot of difficulty with, and I remember just now, Ethiopian injera.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the bread that they have in there, and it's all on a large plate with the food, so you lose track of how much of it you're eating, and the absorption was a little bit odd. It was kind of slow, almost like pizza. So definitely something I forgot to mention. So you definitely have to adjust to keep your eye on things.
So Frannie, obviously with the introduction of new diets and just traveling in general can lead to GI problems or
I knew you were going to ask me this question.
Foodborne illnesses. Sick day plans and sick day management is a big aspect of just diabetes in general. What does your sick day plan look like when you are abroad?
Yes, so I actually had the very worst of the worst happen to me in this exact, and I can't believe I'm telling this story. So you can, the food in Asia is spicy and it can kind of upset your stomach. And I had one absolute terrible experience. We were in Vietnam and we were by this very famous cave system, but there's nothing else around. So, when I was ill, we were looking at the closest hospital was like at least an hour's drive away. And unfortunately, that is when I decided to get like the absolute worst case of food poisoning I have ever had in my life. So it was pretty scary. I was, throwing up to the point I couldn't keep a sip of water down. Blood sugar got pretty low. I think I was in the 50s, holding my glucagon at one point, just like, I can't keep the glucose tabs down. I can't keep anything down. What am I going to do? I ended up, so fortunately, I guess, well, unfortunately, but right before I left for this trip around Christmas, I had another horrible case of food poisoning and I had to go to the hospital here in America, and they ended up sending me home with some suppositories, which I never had to use, but on my packing trip, and which should be on everyone's packing trip as a type 1 diabetic, is some sort of anti-nausea, I think. So before you go anywhere international, especially somewhere with food and you're not sure how it's going to handle, definitely ask your doctor if they can prescribe you a dissolvable anti-nausea pill. That way, if you do get sick or if you have ketones and you're really throwing up, anything like that and you're abroad, just to be able to keep fluids down and get your blood sugar up. But those didn't work in that time. And that is when it dinged in my head that my mom had convinced me to pack these suppositories that I had gotten on my last bout of food poisoning. And thank God, because I don't know if I would have made it through the night possibly without those. So just planning, we've all said, plan for the very worst of what can happen and then hope it doesn't. Yeah.
Ameer, what kind of medicines are you bringing with you when you are traveling abroad, kind of thinking about Franny's story in particular?
No, I think she mentioned, she was on point, anti-nausea and I think anti-diarrheal. Because you want something for traveler's diarrhea, and then you want something, so if you eat something that doesn't agree with you, or, if you eat at some hole in the wall, which I think a lot of us enjoy, you don't know what you're getting all the time, but that's one way to experience the local cuisine. And then another thing to do is, depending on where you're going, and I'm sure y'all both done it, but going to a traveler's clinic is something to consider, because that way you can actually get, any vaccinations you need before you go. Because that's something you should definitely consider before traveling as well. Looking at the CDC guidelines and seeing, what do I need before I go? What might I be exposed to? So just some extra considerations there.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on what a traveler's clinic is?
Well, it just depends. I mean, sometimes you can just go to, and I don't know specific offices. Endocrinologists definitely won't have this, but you could probably go to a primary care, or you could kind of Google travelers clinics in your area. And what they do is they're able to they have access to the vaccines that you may need for the particular travel you're doing. Or, some places in Africa you need, and I guess India potentially, anti-malarials. So just to kind of get the medications you need in preparation. Kind of one step beyond the diabetes.
I have two secret weapons. Yeah, my two secret weapons, I think, to try and combat the GI stuff is Gatorade powder is helpful, just to have a bag of that when it's really hard to keep down other foods, you can always just mix it with water and sip on it to get some nutrients. And then also mini doses of glucagon for low blood sugars in the middle of the night. And that's such a lifesaver. So to mix glucagon, just drop 10 or 20 units of that. So when you can't keep food down and you're having a low, you can easily come up with a mini glucose. So, and then I also have a water bottle that has a UV light filter on it too. And so if you ever have to fill up water somewhere, it can zap your water for you, and you can feel a little bit more confident about drinking it that way if it's from sources you're not sure about.
Great. That's awesome advice. So when you're traveling on a budget, it can often mean that you are also staying in budget accommodations. So that might be a hostel or a community style dorm. Basically, you're in accommodations where your personal items are kind of shared with everyone's personal items. When you are thinking about this, what extra precautions are you taking to make sure that your diabetes devices and your extra diabetes supplies are staying safe?
So I stayed in hostels basically the whole 4 months I was in Asia. I had a great experience. I highly recommend hostel travel to anyone who's interested in it. So the good thing about hostels, like, you are in a shared space. That's part of the experience of them and what makes them so engaging and fun. Most of them, I would say all that I stayed at, had some sort of locker system that you would, the bedrooms are shared, so there's bunk beds, but they'll have lockers somewhere in the room. Just make sure you bring a travel lock. I had the ones I used on my backpack just in case, we had to put my backpack in a bus while it was going somewhere, but then I had an actual metal one as well that I would use on my locker, just to keep everything in there, and always made sure it was locked away if I was gone from the room. And then of course my insulin, which I kept usually hopefully in the private kitchen fridge if that wasn't available, and it was a communal fridge. I just made very clearly that it was labeled with my name and had medicine very largely written on it, so hopefully no one would touch it, and I never had any bad experiences.
Great. So Ameer, when you're traveling, you're commonly going to tourist hotspots, and regardless of where you are, tourist hotspots can obviously be a major zone for con artists or pickpockets, or in worst case scenario, muggings. What are some extra precautions you're taking to safeguard either your diabetes devices or maybe your cell phone, which is talking to your CGM? What's going through your mind?
No, it's a great question. I think with all my travels, I've just eventually kind of gotten to a point where there's certain things I like and certain companies I like to buy things from. Lululemon, they make men's, pants and shorts, and they have zippers on the side. So anything I'm worried about, I could just put my insulin pump in there and close the zipper. So getting somebody taking that would be pretty difficult. And I tend to walk around when I'm traveling with a 16 or 20 liter pack. Got my diabetes supplies. I can put my phone in there if I'm needed, because usually I'm not using my phone when I'm traveling. So they zip, they close. It's very difficult for somebody to get in and actually take something. So I think those are the two things I use. It's not like, you know, a woman's purse, for instance, that's kind of sitting on the side. It's much more difficult to actually get your hand into.
Does anyone have anything to add or a different experience?
I mean, I think neck wallets are super dorky, and I think they exist for a reason. So to put, you know, your passport and and even my insulin pump, as a woman, I can clip it on the inside of my bra, and I always feel safer, you know, when it's on the inside of my shirt if we're in a really crowded area. And I think having those things, my money and my passport, also underneath of my clothing. Also spy belts, or like those workout bands that have pockets, is another helpful way to stash some things. I like the sneaky stuff.
Building off of this question, when you're going out for the day to do a daily activity, are you leaving a certain amount of your supplies at your accommodations? Do you bring all your supplies with you? What are you thinking?
Usually I will leave a certain amount where I'm staying, just because, like Katie was saying earlier, I don't ever want to have all of my supplies in one place at a time unless you're traveling to leave to a new destination. So I would typically take, you know, my insulin. I was on pens. If I'm going out for the day, I had little Frio packs that would fit, you know, 1 or 2 pens. So I'd slide them in there to make sure that those stay cool. Take those out to the day in my pack, along with enough, you know, low supplies, enough. I typically, if I was out for the day, would maybe bring, you know, 1 of my short acting pens and 1 of my long acting pens. And then I knew that I had whatever was back safe in the fridge, not with me at the hostel, just so that it was fine. I think the only times I differed on that is when I couldn't get my insulin in a fridge right away. And I didn't want to leave all of my insulin just sitting in a locker. So in that case, I took about half with me and I left about half.
Cool.
Wasn't doing very hot things that day, obviously. I think anytime when you're going to be out in the heat, you really need to be smart about how much insulin you're taking with you. Enough for, you know, emergencies, but not enough that if it all went bad at once, you don't have any insulin left.
Gotcha.
I really struggle with that, Frannie. I always want to make sure I have enough insulin on my body. So it's always a hard decision whether or not you travel, you know, with 2 bottles outside, or like, and I always want long lasting as a backup, but then that means that it's probably going to go bad, you know, within a month. It's a hard call to make.
It's a little bit of like, it's just about your own trust levels of, you know, and sometimes, especially with traveling, you're not going to ever have like the perfect scenario. You know, you're not going to be home or all of your insulin that you're using is in your fridge. So you have to make like the best of the situation that you have, and just make the smartest decision from there.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
I've never broken a bottle of insulin in my entire life ever. And I've dropped, you know, hundreds of vials of insulin, except, you know, when I was 2 hours away from my supplies in Romania on a cobblestone street when my insulin was when my pump was out of insulin, which is why I was changing it when the bottle slipped from my hands. You're like, ah! So yeah, I think for that reason, I always overpack insulin and I always have a lot of it go bad, and I just feel really terrible about that.
Are there any kind of tips or more general advice just to maybe not look so blatantly like a tourist, or for staying safe when you are traveling to kind of more crowded hot spots? Yeah, Katie, what's your rule of thumb?
I'm just giggling. I'm imagining Patrick right now in like the most touristy outfit possible. He's got like the hat, and the little like triangle of sunscreen, and like his big camera, and maybe a flowered t-shirt.
Don't forget the backpack.
Can rock
Charitable dog t-shirt, actually.
No, I mean, I think it's hard to blend in a lot of places when you're going different places in the world. I don't know if the goal is to blend in as much as it is just to get to know people around you too, and communicate and make partnerships with people that are there, and get to know some of the local people or guides. And I think that's really helpful when you feel like you have people that you know and you trust in an area, even if they're new friends or new acquaintances, that's going to make a big difference from you, or a big difference for you in a place you are. One of my favorite ways to travel is when I know somebody, you know, that's somewhere else. I've been lucky enough to have friends that are in the Peace Corps in different countries, and going to visit them when they've already established connections and relationships somewhere, like, definitely feels different than coming in, you know, as a person from a different country into a new culture, a new place without that foundation. So I think that's my favorite way to get to know a place, is when someone has a connection or a relationship, and I can learn about it in a more intimate way from them and the people that they know there.
Kind of going off Katie too, like it goes such a far way with like any local people. I think if you just make an effort, like, so, you know, every country I visited in Asia, the languages were different, but I would try to at least learn like a few phrases to say to people in their home language, just so that they know that you're trying and you like respect their culture. Like if you try, like people will see that and really respect it more, I think.
Is there anything you wish you would have been told ahead of time before setting off on your first international trip? Frannie, I see you nodding your head. What have you got?
Yeah, I think it's just kind of like everything with diabetes and everything with life. And it's just like, don't be afraid to fail. Like, I think I learned so much when like things didn't go exactly right while traveling, and it helped me prepare for the next trip and the next trip and the next trip. And like, just to let yourself have a little bit of a break. Just like diabetes has its mind of its own sometimes, and things aren't going to work out like you planned. You can plan and plan and plan and plan and pack everything for every situation, and still something is not going to go completely right. And that's okay. And just do the best you can, like get through it and learn from it.
Ameer, if someone living with type 1 is interested in maybe getting their feet wet in international travel and maybe they're not ready to go all the way to Ethiopia, what would be kind of your recommendation for someone getting their feet wet with traveling abroad?
I think find a place you want to go. I think that's, you know, have that list. Like, what are your, I mean, I already have my next travel list. Like, where do I want to go when I can, when coronavirus isn't a thing? But I think find out where you want to go. Make sure somebody will, I would say go with somebody. I think that would be a good idea. Cause like, you know, sharing the experience, you have somebody that can kind of keep an extra eye out on you. Talk to your doctor. I think it's important. That way you can kind of have backup supplies and be planning. But, you know, don't be afraid to try something new. Diabetes is there, but don't let it be a barrier. I think honestly, you can, if you're going to a large city, a touristy place, you're going to have access to the healthcare you need if something does happen.
Great. Rapid fire question, because Ameer made me think about it. Where is the next place you're traveling on your bucket list? Katie, we'll start with you.
Well, I was supposed to be in South Africa last week. So thanks, COVID. So yeah, that will probably be next on the list. We're going to go cage diving with great white sharks for Michaela's 30th. Woo, woo.
Goodness, that's awesome.
Yeah.
All right, Ameer, where are you going? What's on the bucket list?
You know, I kind of want to, you know, I saw the first episode of The Leap, and, you know, Banff and Vancouver are both on my list. I want to get to Iceland, and New Zealand's also on the list. So we'll see.
Very cool. All right, Frannie, where are you going?
Oh God, that's so hard. I've never been to South America, so that's probably like very, very high up there. And probably scuba diving at the Galapagos Islands is probably number one on my bucket list right now.
Very cool. All right, y'all, we are just about to wrap this up. Any last minute things you'd like to add?
This is hilarious. I needed to pee, and I was in a bathroom at a McDonald's in Italy. I'm washing my hand in the sink, and the girl next to me has an insulin pump on her belt. And I was like, ah! And I was showing her my pump, and she was showing me her pump, and we did like a little pump bump. Whenever I see pumps in the wild, I always like try and see if people will high five me with their insulin pump. But it was just this really cool thing, and we couldn't talk to each other at all. I don't know Italian, but we just had this really beautiful connection in a McDonald's bathroom because we both had diabetes. It's very exciting. But I'll just add that I also think that diabetes really sets us up well to do things like traveling. I mean, we know how to prepare. We know how to be super flexible. We know how to roll with the punches. We're always thinking ahead about the next thing. And I think that that's what makes a really excellent traveler, somebody who's, you know, flexible enough and skillful enough to think about those things ahead of time. And so I think diabetes has given me an incredible toolkit to use for traveling. And I think we all owe it to ourselves if we can to see parts of the world. To me, it's like reading books. You know, like every time you read a book, you get to see something from another perspective. And every time you experience another culture, place, you get to see it through new eyes and new perspectives. And it's such a privilege also to be able to travel as much as I have. And I totally acknowledge that. And I I'm so thankful for the opportunities I've had, and I hope that other people can explore stateside, like Ameer said too, or abroad. I think every travel experience we do expands our knowledge of the world and people a little bit more.
You're absolutely right, and I think that's the perfect note to end on. So, Ameer, Katie, Frannie, thank you all so much for being on this episode tonight and for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge and your experiences from your own travels abroad. Hopefully, someone living with type 1 listens to this episode or watches this video and gets inspired to make their own international leap of faith and take their own trip abroad. I will go ahead and link ways to get in contact with you all if anyone is interested in reaching out with their own personal questions. But with that, again, thank you all so much. We will see you next time. And as always, the content in this video and podcast is for informational purposes only. This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have seen or heard in this video or podcast. Reliance on any information provided during today's episode is solely at your own risk. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor or 911 immediately. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you on the next episode of The Leap.